There is an audio recording that a few aviation hobbyists quietly pass around online. Not something officially released, just a piece of radio chatter from a routine flight that should have lasted less than 2 hours. In the recording, a pilot calmly contacts the control tower, sounding confused more than frightened, explaining that another plane has been pacing his aircraft for several minutes, even though he had been told the airspace was empty. The strange part is not only that radar never showed anything near him, but that the pilot kept describing details of the aircraft as if it were extremely close enough to see through the cockpit windows. People who have listened carefully to that recording usually notice something unsettling near the end, something the pilot says in a quiet voice after several minutes of confusion, when he finally gets a clear look at the other aircraft flying beside him. Before we start, please subscribe if you haven't already. The pilot involved in that incident was a man named Daniel Mercer, a quiet and experienced flyer who had spent most of his career transporting small cargo loads between regional airports across the Midwest. He was not the type of person who exaggerated things or chased attention. In fact, most of the people who knew him described him as steady and slightly reserved, someone who preferred predictable routines and long, quiet flights, where the only sounds were the engine and the occasional voice from air traffic control. On the evening when the strange event happened, he had taken off from a small airport outside Wichita just after sunset, carrying a few sealed medical containers that needed to reach a hospital in Oklahoma before midnight. The weather was calm, the sky was clear, and the route he was given followed a quiet corridor of airspace that usually had very little traffic at that hour. The aircraft Daniel was flying was a small twin-engine plane that he had flown dozens of times before, an older but reliable model that handled smoothly even in rough weather. And once he leveled out at cruising altitude, the flight felt like hundreds of others he had completed. He checked the instruments, confirmed his heading, and settled into the familiar rhythm of monitoring fuel levels, engine temperatures, and the occasional update from the control tower. For nearly 40 minutes, everything about the flight was completely normal. The ground below was dark farmland broken only by scattered lights from distant houses, and above him, the sky stretched out wide and empty. Then something small caught his attention through the right side of the cockpit window. At first, Daniel thought it was simply a reflection from one of the instrument lights, the kind of faint flicker that sometimes appears when the cockpit lighting shifts slightly. But when he leaned closer to the window, he noticed that the light outside was moving at exactly the same speed as his aircraft. It stayed in his peripheral vision, a pale glimmer in the darkness just beyond the wing. He turned his head and looked directly at it. There was another plane flying beside him. It was close enough that he could clearly see its silhouette against the faint glow of the moonlight above the clouds, a narrow fuselage with wings almost identical in shape to his own aircraft. And for a moment, Daniel simply stared at it because he knew something about the situation did not make sense. Aircraft were never supposed to appear that close without coordination from air traffic control, especially in a quiet corridor like the one he was flying through. He reached for the radio and contacted the control tower, keeping his voice calm because unexpected traffic was not unheard of. "Control, this is Mercer 274, he said, explaining his altitude and position before adding that another aircraft seemed to be flying parallel to him on his right side. The controller responded almost immediately, sounding slightly puzzled but not alarmed, asking him to repeat the message and confirm his coordinates. Daniel read the numbers again while glancing out the window, and the strange aircraft remained there, gliding smoothly beside him at exactly the same speed. There was a short pause on the radio before the controller spoke again. Radar showed nothing anywhere near Daniel's position. The controller explained that the airspace around him was completely clear. The nearest aircraft was more than 30 miles away, and the radar screen displayed only Daniel's transponder signal moving steadily along its assigned path. Daniel looked out the window again. The other plane was still there. He described it carefully over the radio, saying it looked like a small twin-engine aircraft, possibly the same model he was flying, though the lighting made it difficult to read any markings on the body. The controller asked if it could be a visual illusion, perhaps another aircraft at a higher altitude appearing closer than it really was. But Daniel shook his head even though the controller could not see him. This plane was too close for that explanation. It was flying almost perfectly level with his wing. For several minutes the situation remained strangely calm, Daniel continuing to report what he saw, while the control tower repeated that their radar showed empty sky. The controller even checked with nearby regional stations, asking if anyone else had traffic in that corridor, but every response came back the same. Nothing was there. During that time, Daniel kept watching the other aircraft, and the longer he looked at it, the more unsettling the details became. The shape was correct. The engines were in the same place. The wings had the same slight angle toward the tips, but something about the plane felt wrong in a way that was difficult to describe. The surface looked darker than it should have been, almost like the metal absorbed the moonlight instead of reflecting it, and the cockpit windows were completely black. At one point, the controller asked if he could see the pilot inside. Daniel leaned closer to the glass, squinting through the darkness as the aircraft drifted slightly closer to his own, and he said something that made the controller hesitate for a moment. He thought there was someone sitting inside, but the figure had not moved once since he first noticed the plane. The aircraft continued to match his speed perfectly. It did not drift ahead or fall behind. It simply remained there beside him like a silent reflection. About 10 minutes after the first report, Daniel noticed something else that made the situation feel even stranger. The other plane looked almost identical to his own aircraft, down to the small antenna on top of the fuselage and the position of the landing lights beneath the wings. He even mentioned over the radio that it looked like the same model he was flying, which the controller acknowledged but did not have any explanation for. Then Daniel said he could see something written on the side of the aircraft. The controller asked him to repeat that. Daniel said the letters were faint but visible when the moonlight hit the body at the right angle, and he leaned closer to the window trying to read them clearly while the control tower waited for the answer. There was a long pause. When Daniel finally spoke again, his voice sounded quieter than before. He told the controller that the registration number painted on the other aircraft was the same as his own. The controller immediately responded that such a thing was impossible. Aircraft registration numbers were unique and assigned to only one plane, but Daniel repeated it again slowly, reading each letter and number aloud. It matched his aircraft exactly. For several seconds, the radio channel remained silent except for the faint background hiss of static. Then Daniel said something else. He said the other plane was getting closer. The controller instructed him to maintain course and altitude while they tried to understand what was happening. But Daniel's breathing had changed slightly. The calm rhythm replaced with a careful tension as he watched the strange aircraft drift nearer to his window. He said he could see inside the cockpit now. The figure in the pilot's seat was still there, still not moving, still sitting in the exact position that Daniel himself was sitting. The controller asked him to describe the person. Another pause followed. Then Daniel spoke in a low voice. He said the pilot inside the other plane looked exactly like him. Same headset, same jacket, same posture, but the face was wrong. The controller asked what he meant by that, but Daniel did not answer immediately, because at that moment, the other aircraft moved even closer until its cockpit window was almost perfectly aligned with his own. For the first time, the figure inside turned its head. Daniel stared at the face looking back at him. It had his features, his hair, even the small scar above his eyebrow from an old training accident years earlier. But the eyes were completely black. Daniel's last transmission came a few seconds later. His voice was barely louder than a whisper when he told the control tower that the other pilot was smiling. Radar continued tracking his aircraft for another 3 minutes before the signal suddenly disappeared from the screen. Search teams later combed the entire area along his route, helicopters sweeping over miles of farmland and forest, but no wreckage from Daniel Mercer's plane was ever found. The only thing left behind was that strange recording from the radio channel, the calm voice of a pilot describing another aircraft flying beside him in empty sky. And near the end of the audio, if someone listens very closely, they can hear a second voice faintly bleeding through the static, repeating Daniel's words at the exact same moment he speaks them, as if another cockpit radio somewhere was transmitting the same conversation from the other side.